Welcome to the Food Junkies podcast. Here, we aim to bring you the experience, strength, and hope of professionals working on the front lines in the field of food addiction. Our mission is to educate you, the listener, and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a recognized disorder. Here, we discuss all things recovery, exploring the many pathways people take towards abstinence in order to achieve a health-forward lifestyle. We hope to inspire you to thrive rather than just survive. So stay positive, make a change for yourself, and share your journey with others. And hopefully the message will spread.
Certainly, our understanding of food addiction has grown in the last 4 years, but are we any better at understanding the intersection between food addiction and eating disorders? Welcome to the Food Junkies podcast. My name is Dr. Vera Tarman, and I am your co-host today along with Molly Painschab. Today, we have asked Dr. David Wiss to come back to give us the latest understanding of food addiction and if we are any better at distinguishing between eating disorders such as binge eating disorder and bulimia and food addiction. Is it an either or, a continuum? Can we find common ground to better collaborate with these apparently two diverse groups? Dr. David Wiss is the excellent person to speak to about this. He is a registered dietitian nutritionist with a PhD in public health from UCLA. His work focuses on the interplay within nutrition, eating disorders, and addiction recovery. He is founder of Nutrition in Recovery, which specializes in treating patients with eating and substance use disorders. He is author of a number of excellent publications, my favorite being a must-read review article about food addiction, From Evolution to Revolution, published in Frontiers in Psychology. He has received both the Excellent in Practice Award and the Emerging Dietetic Leader Award. His latest project, Why Is My Nutrition, is an app-based platform for improving mental wellness through nutrition. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me. Super excited. I loved your leading question. Is it an either or is it a continuum? This should be the kind of thesis of my career. Everything I do is the discussion of continuum. So thanks for that.
That's why we're asking you. Can you give us the latest climate between the eating disorder community? Give us the context.
Yeah. The tension has been high, I'm going to say, since early 2011, 12, when food addiction hit the scene. There was a lot of confused eating disorder professionals, and they went to their leadership and said, what's the deal? What's up with this data? And the leadership, the people that write books and do trainings, took very firm positions and said, this does not exist. And that information trickled down through the training programs, and they had a very strong position that all food addiction symptoms come from dietary restraint or restriction. And that was their major hypothesis, was that all of this was just a relic of dieting, because that's what they saw. They work in eating disorder treatment. So they see people with eating disorders and they're saying they have sugar addiction. But when they get them eating regularly, a lot of those people, their symptoms go away. So they had a very strong selection bias based on who they were seeing, and they had very strong conflicts of interest based on the books they wrote and their perspectives, etc. So they dug their heels in really deep and said, this is not a real thing. It doesn't exist. And they had some very clear talking points. It's only in rodents. This isn't in humans. It hasn't been proven. And what's been so interesting is fast forward 10 years later, I still see some of those same talking points in circulation. There's no good human data. It's only in rodents, right? There's no real evidence. They're just recycling because there's so much cognitive dissonance, because the concept of sugar addiction and food addiction not only is contrary to a lot of those eating disorder beliefs, but it might even suggest that they've been doing some things that were potentially harmful. So that's why it really clashes, and no one wants to say I was wrong. So fast forward 2016, I think the political climate in the United States created just more division in society, and there created a very obvious, to me, divide that was no longer hidden. It was crystal clear. It was like, if you talk about these things, particularly the O word, obesity, addiction, right? There were people at conferences that would storm the microphone. And it became a very hostile environment in the eating disorder world. You are not welcome here. if you talk about these things, right? And I'm just sitting back and observing the whole thing. I'm like, this is wild, because I know people that come from this different world, and I understand scientific phenomenon. I have a personal addiction story. I understand the neurobiology. I understand the continuums. And I was watching people get super split. And I watched people who were, I'm going to use the term, in the middle, just feel conflicted and feel like they had to declare an allegiance. And if you were in the eating disorder field and you didn't declare your allegiance to the eating disorder field, there was hostile energy and you were no longer considered acceptable, right? And so there's all these signals that came out of that conflict, language, right? Haze aligned, intuitive eating, right? Health, right? There was very clear weight neutral, right? There was very clear language that signaled, I am from this party, not from this party. And it was so obvious to me. And I'm just watching it and I'm like, there's some great stuff going on over there. There's some great stuff going on over there. Let's come together and have conversations about it. And it was very slow progress, 2016, 17. And then in the last year, I think there's some progress happening. There's been some really smart people that have said, you know what, I'm wrong, booked a session with me, picked my brain. There's a lot of people that are coming out who were previously having their heels in the sand to say, you know what, we can't ignore this anymore. Let's have conversations. But when that happens, there's also this kind of last gasp for, right, like the resistance. And so we're currently experiencing a lot of people from the eating disorder world who were vehemently opposed to addiction, sugar addiction, coming around saying, okay, there's obviously something here. There's funding, there's data, the ultra-processed food research cannot be ignored. And in doing so, it's causing a little bit more unrest because some people are like, wait a minute, right? And people are angry. And so I've been the guy. I just walk on the battlefield and I take the darts and the arrows. I say the things. I say I represent all sides. I represent peace. And God, it's been really lonely. And it's been hurtful and it's been difficult. I'll just be honest, right? This journey of peacemaking, of integration, of science, of open-mindedness. And I'm really excited about this idea that there's integration ahead.
We're on your side here. The traditional model, we've got the eating disorder model, which is, just to put it simply, a psychological response, disordered eating, internal disturbance, which can be treated. And there's the food addiction model, this chemical external trigger that even if you're in the best of mind, you can be overrun and hijacked. How can you see a common ground there?
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out little historical legacy, because in my investigative journalism on these topics, right, I have talked to people that are different than me, that think different than me, as a way of making peace. And here's one really important thing that I learned. Each side thinks they are the counter-revolution to the other side, right? Historically, the food addiction stuff has actually been around longer than the eating disorder stuff. It was the original model from the 60s, early OA, 70s, 80s, 90s, the diet culture days. And the eating disorder folks saw their movement as a response to that. And they're saying, what? We've been here before. We've done this. We've done gray sheet. We know this. I have spent decades cycling in and out, right? And so the eating disorder mindset is that the food addiction is yesteryear. We've seen it that way. We're no longer doing that. We are the new movement, right? And they don't see the new data. A lot of the old timers in the eating disorder world, the advocates, they're just remembering the 80s and the 90s, the diet culture, the harm that was caused. And they believe that the eating disorder movement is the counter to that. And now the food addiction, fast forward 2025 now, the emerging neuroscience of food addiction that's popping in the literature in the last few years feels like the counterculture to what you've described, which is a very psychosocial focused intervention where it really is just about making peace with food and making peace with body and working on internal family systems, actual family systems, right? Learning how to regulate emotions and they're both, right? The current food addiction is a response to the long-held eating disorder model, which is just saying that a calorie is a calorie and the food doesn't really matter. The food addiction is science says that's wrong. For some people, the food matters. It's complex neurobiology, and we need to think about it when we think about treatment. And the eating disorder mindset is, no, we've been there and done that. We're not doing that anymore. And I believe that we need to come together and reconcile these. They're almost like spiritual differences.
Yeah, David, you got to write a review article about this very issue. Yes.
I think so too.
I think so. So where is the common ground in this? Because you're right. I think it's both. How can
I believe that all of the facets that are pretty well established in treatment work really well for both, right? When you think about safety and stabilization, getting people in community, fed and well-nourished, consistency, right? Being in a place where you learn how to tell the truth, working through your unresolved issues, learning a little bit about your condition, all of those things, whether it be full clinical or step-based, spirituality-based, all of the things that work in substance use disorder treatment, food addiction treatment, eating disorder treatment, bio-psycho-spiritual, they're all helpful for all of these conditions, particularly if there's a trauma-informed focus, right? I think that the only major differences have to do with concepts of rigidity and fluidity, right? The idea that rigidity is the problem is the eating disorder mindset. And then in the addiction mindset, there is some belief that rigidity is actually the solution. And that's a major source of conflict. And obviously that plays out with food, but it also plays out in a therapeutic context. If someone is really working to eat in a way that's going to help heal their brain from the ravages of addiction, but their therapist is challenging all of their cognitive rigidity and saying you need to ease up and just lighten up, right? There's a conflict there. So it is about the food, the differences, but also this understanding that everyone has a different neuropsychiatric profile and that there isn't a manual that is going to work for all people. And a really good therapist or a really good dietitian will be able to sit in front of someone and understand that their psychological and psychiatric profile is different from the last person that came in. It's a lot to ask because dietitians and therapists who work in eating disorder treatment centers don't get paid a lot of money. They come in, they get trained, and you're getting trained to do this thing, right? And we have a thing that we do. So it's almost unrealistic to expect people that work in these settings to be able to like deeply discern, to do differential treatment. It's burdensome on the staff too, you know, to have the chef making one person's meal with salad dressing that has sugar in it and the other person's with salad dressing that doesn't. That's a really big ask for culinary staff. You know what I'm saying? And so when I've helped places think about these things, it can get fatiguing, right? Or you train a chef to learn about these different ways of thinking, or a dietitian to learn about these different ways of thinking, discernment. Guess what happens? Yeah, they leave the job. Someone else comes in that came from another treatment center, and they're like, oh, we're going back to this thing that we do. We're just doing it over again. And then it's just, oh, so difficult. So how do we create a widespread culture of open-mindedness where everyone is asking more questions and having more answers? And that's the kind of change that takes a generation.
Before we get to hypothesizing what that might look like, back up a bit. Would you go so far as to say that we might not even need those distinguishing diagnoses of eating disorder or food addiction, that we can see it all as a continuum in some way?
Yeah, that's how I operate. That's the difference between a PhD and an MD, right? Like an MD's job is to come up with the diagnoses, which leads to a treatment, right? I'm a philosopher. You know what I'm saying? I'm into nuance and mental health science and continuums. So I don't feel this need to be able to say, this is the diagnosis, therefore this is the treatment. But if you work in a treatment center, you have to do that. That is what the insurance company requires of you. So it almost forces people to think in the diagnostic box, right? You need to put it in the chart. You need to describe the interventions, the progress. And so it limits people. The insurance model of treatment and the charting that's required limits people from thinking in these out-of-the-box ways. And that's why I've been so fortunate. I've consulted for treatment centers and done that work a lot early in my career. We run groups at treatment centers. But the majority of treatment that I do is in an outpatient basis where I'm not constrained by these are the diagnoses. This is what the chart has to look like. I can be creative. I can be spiritually guided. I can be intuitive, and I can do this kind of deep, meaningful work with people.
Do you actually then use a diagnosis of binge eating disorder or anorexia or bulimia in your work?
If someone needs a super bill, but what's the real value of labeling people? That's not super clear to me. It could help the person and the family. I will let someone know, you working with this. This is what we're up against, right? But it doesn't necessarily dictate the way that I think about the client or patient or change, right? Of course, it's informative, but it's not what I rely on for my cognitive processes for treatment.
I would jump in there too. And I just want to back up what you're saying, David, as a clinician myself and stepping out of the traditional clinical role and really moving more into this recovery coaching space kind of deal. It gives me more latitude. So while a label, a diagnosis might help that individual at the time to make sense of something, it doesn't actually inform me or that person as to what their treatment trajectory is going to look like. Because when we're taking it from a bio-individual aspect or from that perspective, I want to be able to think outside of the box where those labels typically, when I worked in agency, were way more helpful because it had to be cookie cutter. Like you were saying, I was trained to the way the next person was trained. And then I started getting my own ideas. Then I was burning out because I kept getting met with restriction from the agency I worked within because they're like, you can't do it that way. Or then it's a whole can of worms. And now everybody's going to want to be treated that way. And we just can't do that. So I moved on. And then, you get the next person in and they get trained in that same cookie, which is effective to treat big groups of people.
Scale treatment. Yeah.
Yeah. But then does that account for why 30% of people in eating disorder, is that part of the reason why 30% of people don't find good effect with that treatment or whatever? So I'm with you. I love that. I love the labels. I hate them personally. I love them because they give people something to tether to feel less chaotic when they don't have answers. But then I think after that, if we can just look at the person in front of us and treat what's actually happening, we don't actually need those labels. I'm with you. Yeah.
I like outliers. I call them the forgotten groups, right? The peeps that are just not easily classified, that don't fit into boxes that connect to treatment trajectories. The marginalized folks, the people that don't respond well to mainstream treatment. Those are my folks.
Yes, I always I know I'm always my freak flag is flying because clearly you found me. We're the exception to the rule for one reason or another. And not in the, that, what do they call it in 12-step? The unique.
Oh, yeah. About the terminal
uniqueness. It's not that so much as it's literally, I've tried everything that conventional medicine or treatment has told me to try, and it's not working for me, or I'm not getting the same effect, or it's not working in the way that my best hopes imagine them to. Can we think outside of the box? I appreciate your take on that.
I also like when I get people that are just textbook, and I'll tell someone that. I'm like, hey, listen, you're a snowflake, you're a unique human being, but what you're dealing with is super textbook, and there's a very clear solution for this, and we're going to get you out of this mess in a few months.
I think you really nailed it. There's a divisiveness of rigidity versus fluidity. That's just a really good way to describe the differences. There is a rigidity in the food addiction world of no sugar, no refined ultra-processed foods, which is essentially no unhealthy foods. And in the eating disorder community, it's any foods, including unhealthy foods. But why can't we say no unhealthy foods for anybody? That means that the food addiction and the eating disorder win because they're not eating unhealthy food. And intuitive eating might actually work for both camps because they're not eating addictive food.
I agree that people with eating disorders shouldn't preclude them from being able to eat healthy food. And that's one of my rooftop messages. However, there are a lot of people whose eating disorder symptoms are rooted in obsession and rigidity about food quality. And that is actually the thing that's impairing their life, right? So I don't know the percentage, but I get people that come to me and it's not so much just calories. Of course, they probably have that mindset or macros, but they are deeply triggered and fearful of particular foods. Maybe they learned from their dad at age 12 that they should not eat bread because they were pudgy, and they never got over that. And they have deep emotional conflict around bread, right? There are times when people with classic eating disorders need to work to eat the foods that have plagued them. And that is actually the marker of recovery for some people, not for all of them. But because that is true, that piece gets extrapolated to the entire population of people with eating disorders and say, if you have an eating disorder and this diagnosis, it means that you're afraid of bread and you need to eat it in order to be well. And actually, I'm not afraid of bread. I've been eating bread every day for 10 years, and me including it adds nothing to my recovery. It just threatens my nervous system, and I don't know why you're treating me this way. In fact, I'm going to discharge. You know what I'm saying? Right? And that's the problem that we see. But there is people that have restrictive eating disorders, and I don't really endorse the term orthorexia nervosa. I do believe that the food companies love that term and have weaponized it. But there are people who have symptoms that look like orthorexia nervosa that are deeply unwell and need to learn how to eat in moderation. And I'll be honest, I love doing this work because of the way my brain works. I like being like on the whole continuum. I really enjoy helping people make peace with food and learn how to eat dessert because they just spend too much time running and eating salad. I actually really enjoy doing that work. Like, it's my career, right? So this idea that all people should be one way or the other, I think we're actively dispelling today, right? That people just need different things. And it's one of the reasons why this field isn't going to make such good progress, is because there isn't evidence-based protocols for all the people that have all the things.
Can we also throw a wrench in there too when we talk about, like, Vera, the way you presented that? I think my first place that I went to are the social justice issues. The advocate in me is, but what about my clients who the access to their, like, the major portions of foods that they have access to are from the food bank. So they're shelf stable. They are going to be things that come in cans, come in packages, and they're not necessarily green beans. It might be SpaghettiOs. Yeah. And how do I help my clients navigate that too? And so I want to give that to you too, David, from that perspective of Vera's question. Like, how do those clients fit into your answer?
I'll go off on a tangent here today. I'm like from UCLA, and my public health background is in the social determinants of health. And what we do in public health, community health sciences is we're only interested in marginalized groups. We don't give any attention or any resources to people that have resources. You know what I'm saying? Like, it is the essence of public health sociology, epidemiology, right? And that is how I was trained and how I was taught to think about population health. And I believe it to be super, super important. And what I've noticed in the last few years, as the tension around food supply, food industry, ultra-processed foods has built up, that narrative has become weaponized as a way of saying, you're so insensitive to these disadvantaged people. How dare you talk about the food supply? And I've noticed that really strong, emotionally charged issue is being used by people that want to counter the argument that we need to do something about the food supply. And it's being spun in a way that my nervous system has picked up on. That if you are a social justice warrior, that will be your talking point, and you will say there's nothing wrong with the food. We need to give people what they can afford. And what I would say, as someone that's strongly trying to advocate against the food companies, is that if it is true that we have disadvantaged populations that can't afford healthy food, then we have even more responsibility to make sure that food is not toxic, poisonous, and addictive, and that it is our job to make sure that food doesn't become another unspoken tool of oppression for those groups. And we need to make sure that they have access to real food, and that's what government and public health should be doing.
And making that food affordable. accessible and affordable.
I believe that big pharma and big food have found their ways to amplify a lot of these social issues so that people feel emotionally charged and don't want to join the efforts against them because they want to feel more sensitive to people. And I am deeply sensitive. I spent my whole career working with a wide range of bodies, right? But when I've seen these voices get amplified, I know what it is. It's putting gasoline on a really valid fire for the sake of thwarting a narrative. And that narrative is that there's something systemically wrong that has to change. A lot of times the playbook from big food and big pharma is to get people to come to this place of, you know what, everything's just fine. We need to focus on these other issues. It's business as usual. What are we tripping off? There's nothing wrong with Red 3. What are we wasting our time on Red 3 for? Red 3 is a symbol. It's symbolic that people have voices and that change is coming. Is removing Red 3 going to revolutionize the food supply? No, but it's holding people accountable, holding corporations accountable. And I think it's valuable.
Can I go back to some clinical? We're on to the political, which is fine, but let's do the clinical. If you're not going to easily go to those diagnostic tools, it sounds to me you're going to have to use your own intuitive judgment. But for the clinician, how will they know that they've got somebody who's dealing with a eating disorder, anorexia versus food addict?
Yeah, I use tools, standard screening tools. I use diagnostics. I'm just saying you reach a point in the clinical trajectory where that isn't the thing that you depend on. You have what we call clinical intuition, and that comes from talking to someone for 50 minutes. That is the intake process. So combining some screening tools with a semi-structured interview, right? By the end of that chat, or even in the first 5 minutes sometimes, you get a sense of someone's leanings, their background, their tendency for psychiatric clustering around maybe either OCD, perfectionism, if they have some neurodivergence on the ADHD, on other spectrums, right? How much addiction is showing up, what the trauma picture might be looking like, their nervous system, the role of diet culture in their lives. You get a sense of all of this stuff through talking to someone about their childhood, their eating, their health, their medical, their parents, right? And it all comes together. And then in the last 10 minutes of a session, you start exploring, these are some things that I think might be really helpful to you, and seeing how someone responds to some of those suggestions, and also making it clear is I don't have a really clear picture. I'd love it if you could log your food for me on the Wise Mind Nutrition app, and I could follow you and give you likes and comments and look at your journaling at the end of the day. And when we meet again in a week, we're going to have a really good picture of what might be a good nutrition intervention. In the meantime, here's a few things that I'd love for you to work on. It would be great if you could get all the different food groups every day. You could try to get 3 food groups at every meal, right? If you could never go more than 5 hours without eating, if you could focus on drinking water and try to get all the colors of the rainbow every day, let's just start there. And we'll check in a week and see what things you're doing great that we can build on, and see if there's some other things that we need to change and modify and move you in the direction of recovery.
You had in one of your articles, not a continuum, but it was like a box, a person linear and vertical. Do you still use that?
That's the DFANG model, the Disordered Eating Food Addiction Nutrition Guide.
Yeah.
And that was some of the early work from 2016. And it really looked at food addiction and anorexia nervosa as opposites in some ways. And it looked at binge eating disorder and bulimia nervosa. And I think the ask from the model was, if someone has binge eating or bulimia, you want to plot them to see if they're closer to the classic anorexia nervosa type or closer to the food addiction type, right? And that might inform what kind of an intervention, for example, how often someone should eat dessert, or if they should eat dessert at all. And that paper really used substance use disorder and other addictions as the proxy for understanding food addiction. I've come to learn that there's a lot of people that have food addiction that have no other addictions. That is their sole thing. Nothing else even came close. They never even could compete with the dopamine response from food. But cross addiction is one way. What was missing from the defang was a deeper understanding of trauma. And so the later work that we did added, this is the separating the signal from the noise, added a much more involved picture of ACEs and PTSD symptoms as a way of understanding where someone might lie on that continuum. And this is based on the knowledge that early life adversity and trauma are stronger predictors of addictions than they are of classic eating disorders. Now, I'm not saying that they don't predict eating disorders, but in terms of magnitude, and my research shows this as well, that ACEs are stronger predictors of more impulsive, compulsive, addiction-like neurochemistry and behaviors rather than purely restriction. The caveat there is that the addiction can lead to the restriction, right? So there is a pathway where people have trauma, they have loss of control, and then they learn how to purge and restrict, and then it ends up on the eating disorder outcome. So my research from my private practice, over 300 patients, I did some structural equation modeling, and I show ACEs lead to ultra-processed food consumption, which leads to ultra-processed food addiction, which then leads to eating disorders. So this work is challenging the long-held assumption that food addiction is a relic of dieting. We are now able to show empirically that a lot of dieting is a result of food addiction, that it starts with the loss of control eating and the food addiction, and it ends up becoming the purging, all the other things, the obsession with appearance, et cetera. And I think that's where these next few years of research is really going to wake up and shake up the eating disorder community and say, actually, your conceptual model is backwards. Right. It's not that dieting leads to addiction. It's that addiction makes people start dieting. And that's the piece that I think is going to really shake up the field.
So we're waiting for another model that's going to incorporate this new information.
I wrote a book chapter in 2019 or 20 that gave these two different models. It was like, oh, which one stems from which? And it's not that one is right or the other is wrong. It's that they're both right. They both have a role in looking at the public health picture, and it's going to vary from person to person.
Is this a model that might be helpful for clinicians who are listening and who are puzzled about what do I do with this food addiction, eating disorder?
Yeah. When we say model, we're talking about boxes with arrows. You know what I'm saying? These are this is what we do in epidemiology. You stay awake at night and you're like, wait, this runs here, connects here. Does the signal flow this to this or this to this? And I believe in making multiple models. And then the hard part, which is I've done a little bit of this, is putting them to the test. You create a conceptual model and then you test it with data, right? That's the harder part.
So what would you say to a clinician listening who's confused about this model?
I guess the advice is to make a timeline of someone's lived experience. We do this in functional medicine to try to figure out the causal structure of what's going on, right? And a timeline can be very helpful. I think people do it in the eating disorder recovery space as like a dieting timeline, right? When did it start? But if you think about adding trauma, early like addictions, right? Life stressors, all the things, and you start to see the diet and how it all plays together, you can get a really clear picture if someone is a little bit more on the classic eating disorder spectrum or a little bit more on the food addiction spectrum, which is, I think, the whole point of our talk today. But guess what? They cluster and co-occur. It's like anxiety and depression. Most people are on both spectrums. You're going to come across people that are more one than the other. For example, I have anxiety, but I do not have depression. I am not a depressed person. I've never spent a day in bed. I have zero depressive symptoms, but I have anxiety. A lot of people have both. You see what I'm saying? And there are people that have very clear depressive symptoms that aren't plagued by anxiety. You get what I'm saying? And food addiction and eating disorder is just like that. Most people have symptoms of both, but every once in a while you get a very clear signal of someone who is very obviously more one than the other. And that's when the treatment trajectory pops. You're like, okay, this is more clear. I know what to do, but most people are in that muddy gray area in between. And that's where clinicians are baffled.
Okay, and so on that point, let's talk treatment. What are we going to do? You have some ventures. You have your Wise app. You have, tell us what.
The Wise Mind Nutrition app has come such a long way, and I'm super excited about it because, it's morphed from being educational videos to being a place to log food to now being a place where people can connect. So I have a lot of features where the practitioners can really follow people and give feedback now, which is really exciting for me because I'm following all my clients and I'm now able to drop comments and give encouragement, let them know I looked at their food logs. Wise Mind Nutrition is the essence of what I'm talking about today, this middle ground, great area space where it is someone finding their way and more engagement and feedback features are coming, which is super exciting. Right now, it's like you got to kind of work to find your way. And people that are doing the work are having life-changing experiences. A lot of people just do the food log and don't watch the videos. And then I have a lot of people that come in for the education and the handouts and the blogs and the recipes and don't want to do the food log. So it's both options for people. You could just do, I just want to learn and watch a video and read a blog and get a recipe every day. Or I'm actually good on David Wiss's videos. I'm going to just log my food. You know what I mean? And really just reflect, set intentions, journal. People that do both are crushing it. People that are actually getting information, implementing it, changing their intentions, connecting with people are having life-changing experiences. And it's like getting treatment is expensive when insurance doesn't pay for it. And I just feel so proud of Wise Mind Nutrition because I've had people get recovered from an eating disorder for $39. You know what I mean? Just 3 months of being subscribed and stuff like that. I'm just like, this is incredible. People are really getting good results for practically $0.
So they've come in with a muddle of symptoms and you're offering them an app, individualized, personalized nutritional therapy.
There's targeted messaging based on the assessment tools for food addiction and eating disorder, but that's not the essence of what I do. The essence is to get people to think in new ways, to have an open mind, to not fall prey to boxes and categories, to really start to question, to grow, right? So the app doesn't just tell people what to eat. It challenges people on how to think dialectically with the both and rather than the either or. Not to say, right, I am this and it looks this way, to be open to the possibility that if you try something and then you do a journal entry in the night, you could change your mind. Things could look different. So it's this adventure of curiosity that makes people position for success afterwards. I think when we give people treatment, which is you have this diagnosis, here's your food plan for food addiction, let me know how it goes. It can be very helpful, but at some point the person can feel a little disempowered. The journey of learning and doing assignments and reflecting and sharing and eating food with people and right, that's going to empower someone to where when they're done with the journey, it wasn't as quick. It was messy along the way. The 2 months of work was messy, but at the end they landed somewhere where it was much more fruitful in the long term.
Can we have a more specific example? Because I like the concrete. I'm coming in, I have a binge eating disorder, I eat too much a lot of the time. I know I have to stop, but the moment I try that triggers my anorexic behavior from years ago. I'll start to restrict far too much, so I don't know what to do. What would you do with somebody that comes in like that?
Safety and stabilization is first. You can't expect to just stop binge eating if you've tried everything. But what you can expect to do is try to lead with some consistent behaviors, like just eat regularly throughout the day, get all the food groups, drink 2 liters of water, do some reflections, maybe have a morning practice, be honest with people. And if you're binging still at night, great. Let's keep on keeping on. Don't give up. Let's still eat breakfast the next day. You see what I'm saying? If you're going to just actively engage in in growth and you're going to set an intention every morning and you're going to be honest with people, you're going to get better over time if you don't give up. I really do believe that. And there's obviously exceptions. Some people really struggle with deeper issues that one meeting a week or a mobile app isn't going to be able to address. Let's be crystal clear. Some people need to go to a trauma treatment. Some people need to go to the rainforest, right? There's a lot of different things that people need, all right? And I do believe, though, that with containment of safety and just sending a signal to your body, it's almost like trauma treatment for the body, but like you are getting regular and consistent nourishment. You are well fed. You are well nourished. There are no hurries. There are no worries. There's no scarcity. There's no abundance. We're just here getting into a routine, and let's calm the nervous system. And once we've got repleted nutritionally, sky's the limit. You want to make some changes? Let's do that. It might take a month of eating regularly and just checking in with folks before like it becomes obvious that you should do something like stop eating grains, for example, right? There's some people that would probably do better off removing grains, but let's find that out as opposed to starting there. I believe that if that is what's true for someone, that will show up. That will show up. If you do daily logging and daily reflections, that will emerge.
It's redundant to say that your Wise Mind Nutrition app is appropriate for anybody on this spectrum of food addiction eating disorder.
That was my biggest hope and desire, was to create something that would be safe for all people. Yes. And it's also one of the criticisms that I gotten about the app, that it's too catch-all, that people don't, it's a medium white t-shirt, right? That people aren't like, oh, this is the app for night eating syndrome. This is the app for binge eating disorder. It's vague enough to where anyone could come in and get what they need. But it's also vague enough to where someone is, I have to do some of the thinking. I have to create my own treatment, etc. So it is the ultimate plus with the app, but it's also the thing that's made it difficult for some people, because a lot of people do just want to be told what to do. And I understand that so deeply. I just didn't create the app that was going to tell people what to do. It's going to ask people to make decisions about what to do. And of course, as the future evolves and my AI chatbot emerges, there might be a little bit more of that. But my commitment to Wise Mind Nutrition is that it will always be empowering. It will never be, it's never going to be predatory, which is, here's your meal plan. Thanks. It's always going to be, hey, I really want to see you go to the grocery store and do this work. Too much nutrition stuff is predatory. And that's why I think a lot of the eating disorder field has a bone to pick with a lot of the nutrition stuff out there. It's like there's a difference between giving someone what they want and giving someone what they need. And there's a lot of nutrition practitioners that just give people what they want, and it's not the thing that's going to change their life. It's the thing that might create a transaction, but it's not what people truly need. They need to do the deeper work.
Define what you mean by predatory. I got lost there.
Yeah. So for example, if someone has, this is my opinion, okay, clearly, if someone has a long history with binge eating disorder and they are searching for a single consult with a dietitian to give them a fixed food plan, there's a dietitian out there that will happily take their $200, meet with them and give them the same handout that they have saved on their hard drive and be like, I changed it. I changed this thing. And they feel satisfied because they got their food plan from a professional. Yes. They could tell their sponsor, right? They're happy. And to me, like, if that were the thing that translated to long-term success, would we be in this mess? And I'm like, no, obviously there's a need for much more. So maybe predatory is a strong word, but when I think about predatory, I think more about running ads to vulnerable people.
False promises. Right? Yeah.
I think it feels really irresponsible, right? As a professional in the field, it feels really irresponsible. I'm not a person who can do that. Obviously, like my flavor of how I work with people is slightly different, but that is one of the things that I think as a professional who advocates for my marginalized community that I work with, it's really problematic because it doesn't take into consideration the person that's in front of me. And then I end up doing a lot of work to undo what's been done because of that interaction or those several interactions that happen with that kind of thing. Like you said, David, predatory may be maybe not the totally correct word, but it's certainly irresponsible. It doesn't feel like an ethically responsible way to treat the person in front of us.
A lot of weight loss stuff online comes across as predatory to a lot of people.
Yeah, in that respect, I totally get what you mean. But I have to admit, I have been at fault, especially in my Facebook group, when people say, what should I do? I say, just hire a nutritionist and get a plan. So I appreciate that.
Great place to start. It's a great place to start. You know what I mean? And I like doing that work, assuming someone like is interested in at least coming back in a month. Let's check in about it. You know what I mean? But the single shots are difficult for me. I don't feel like I'm doing the work that I'm cut out to do.
All right. Molly, did you have more clinical questions? I thought we'd go back to the politics.
Yeah, I want to get into the social justice aspect of it. We only have 9 minutes. You can't get too deep into it, David. You're getting all excited.
I'm getting excited.
David, what can we do to be more palatable, pardon the pun, to the eating disorder community so that we can connect? Any strategy?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of areas of friction. There's been some asks from that community, and I'm a part of that community. Like, for example, to be mindful about certain words, like the O word, obesity. And I don't believe that people should have to tiptoe through life and not say things that someone else is sensitive to. But I do believe in being sensitive to other people, right? It's just this never ending kind of battle, right? I have a concept called nutritional tribalism, right? Which describes these different groups. But apparently that term has pissed some people off. You know what I mean? That this is insensitive to indigenous cultures, et cetera. And that's the kind of energy. It's okay, I'll never be able to say anything right at this point. But yeah, there are certain phrases and concepts that can be minimized and other concepts that can be amplified. And really the most charged is the body autonomy, issues of weight, quote unquote, obesity. And I think the food addiction space has done a good job in the last few years. And I think I've made a difference in helping people understand that if you remove the weight stuff from it, it'll be more palatable to people and to professionals. But there's going to be a lot of eating disorder professionals that are going to see in this, this is weight loss in disguise, right? They're just not using that word. Yeah. But the divide is such to where people are looking for signals. You're looking for words that signal group allegiance. You get what I'm saying? And that's the sad part. There's a set of, I gave you a set earlier. There's a set of words that you can say to let the eating disorder world know that you are with them. And there's a set of words that you could say to let the food addiction world to know, right? And so like thinking about that.
What about the medical world? They don't want to hear about food addiction either. They're okay with eating disorder, but not food addiction.
I don't agree with that. I think a lot of cardiologists and people that do diabetes care are deeply interested in the concept of ultra-processed foods being addictive. And I think that a lot of them can present that to their patients, and that the eating disorder world doesn't appreciate it because they don't say it with the kind of sensitivity that I might. You see what I'm saying? And they end up like getting in their 15-minute consult. They need to stop eating addictive, ultra-processed foods, and now they have emotional conflict and distress, and they're binging, right? Yeah, the medical doctor world is tricky. I think the eating disorder community has been upset with a lot of their ways for a long time and has this idea that they're going to change them, right? They're change the medical fraternity.
Molly, go ahead with your politics.
I guess for me, you had touched on it with the idea of ACEs and trauma-informed care. And we started to talk a little bit about like food insecurity, not to mention there are all kinds of social justice issues that go along with what we're talking about today. And I think, again, that's where the idea of a continuum or a spectrum makes so much more sense, because when we're not taking into consideration the whole person in front of us, we're not doing anybody any justice. And I agree with you. It feels a little predatory or, again, ethically irresponsible. What do you think is like the major social justice issue? Since that's like your wheelhouse, what is the thing that we're not addressing? Maybe both ends of the spectrum, whatever. What are we not doing well enough?
Yeah. Thank you for that. This is a partial answer, which is that the other continuum that I want to invite people to think about, right? We offer this continuum of disordered eating, restrictive, addiction-like eating, there's also a continuum between individual health and public health, right? That there's a difference between what a person should hear and what the country should hear, and there's a sensitivity for different language there. And what works for everyone obviously doesn't work for each person, right? What works for a person doesn't work for everyone. And we need to think about ways to talk about nutrition, health, body image, the food supply in a way that's sensitive to people and to populations as a whole. And I think that a lot of people get caught up in either one or the other. Like I sometimes talk about ultra processed foods about public health. It's a public health crisis that low income kids don't get food that's not poisonous, right? It's a public health issue. And then an eating disorder advocate might hear that and say, oh, you're telling that kid that he can't eat that food? They're going to start dieting and binging. No, we're talking about population versus people. And to start thinking about those trade-offs and how information messaging can differ, I think is super, super important.
Okay.
I agree. I'm a big fan of, and maybe this is wrong, but this is my opinion as a mother, as a person who grew up with extreme poverty and getting government assistant food, like standing like in line for the commodity boxes and being on WIC and food stamps and all the things. My philosophy is fed is best. At the end of the day, fed is best. If my kid is, or a kid that my kid goes to school with is hungry and I give them a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, I will not tolerate disdain from anybody in the food addiction world telling me I'm just feeding them sugar. Like that is a hill somebody's going to die on. It's not going, I will stand in the face of anybody who says it, because at the end of the day, if we don't have people alive long enough to address these things, it goes back to harm reduction and thinking about other substance use disorders too, right? So I agree with you, David. There's just so many nuances to this in the spectrum of, from a public health perspective, what are the things that maybe are not so great for us as populations as a whole? But then when we think about those individuals and that day-to-day survival and hopefully moving just out of survival into thriving,
Yes.
We really have to consider those things. And so if there's any message that we can take from this today, I really hope that it's this idea of not thinking in absolutes and really staying curious and flexible with our thinking. So thank you so much from me for being here. Vera, I'm going to kick it back to you.
And in order to do that, in order to stay flexible in our thinking, we have to do our own healing work. If someone has a lot of unresolved trauma, being able to hold dialectical truths is going to be more difficult. So we have to do our own work to be open-minded and open-hearted.
Good. We have to do our closing now. What's next for you? But I've already told you we need an article on the review of food addiction and like the history of those two communities. And it sounds like I'm going to tell you another one. We need to get clarity on this model that you were proposing earlier. So.
Yeah, I think I can write a few things this year. I've been a co-editor of a couple special issues, and that's really exciting. And I probably have a couple pieces coming. But just moving more into the space of tech and AI, just so I don't get left behind.
Okay. All right. Signature question. If you could tell a younger version of yourself just entering your studies as a nutritionist or as a researcher, what would you tell them about this intersection of eating disorders and food addiction?
I would ask my younger version and anyone else who's listening to be mindful of seeing the world through the lens of your own experience. And just remember that our own bias and our own skew is very real, and what's true for us is not necessarily true for everyone else.
All right. Keep an open mind sort of thing.
That part.
Right on. Okay. Thank you so much, David, for a wonderful and exciting conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us this week on Food Junkies Recovery from Food Addiction. Make sure to join our Facebook group, Sugar Free for Life Support Group, I'm Sweet Enough. Molly and Clarissa are food addiction professionals who offer one-to-one counseling and group coaching through Sweet Sobriety. Please subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in today's episode, we'd appreciate you leaving us a review on your favorite platform. Your feedback helps grow our show and allows us to reach others who need to hear this message of recovery. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies. And as Vera always says, the power is ours.